Hello, guys. Oh, what the? Hold on. Okay, so this video is a waste of your time because all I'm going to do is say one word for a long, long time. So I will be saying this one word on lots of different things. Lots and lots. First thing, this. This is how you will see the word. Right. This right here is the word subscribe. That is the word subscribe. I'm gonna say that word a lot. First, let's go to Fortnite because this video is a waste of your time. So, subscribe. Subscribe and like the video. Subscribe. I will obviously be playing Fortnite while I do this though, and other things. Subscribe. Don't ask how many times I'm going to say it because I don't know. I'm not going to count. Subscribe. How about this? Subscribe. This one next. Subscribe. Oh. Subscribe. This one next. You know what? Never mind. I'm just gonna. Ooh, button. Oh, okay. Next. Not this. This. I want this one. Okay. We have two people on. I want them to help me, but first, subscribe. Okay, now that that's done, I will invite one person. Okay, he will play with me while I do this. Hopefully he joins. Hopefully he joins. I invite you. Okay, but I'm going to screen that while I play. First, let's play a match of. Well, let's just play some nice trios fill. See if they like this. Oh yeah, but first, while we steal this, subscribe. Dang it. Subscribe. By the way, I'm doing this, and I'm also wasting my time. I could just be doing something, watching YouTube right now, but no. I'm gonna do this. Subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. This is annoying. Subscribe, 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 sub. Let's also load up Minecraft because I can do it there too. I have to be in the match for what's your word? Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Hold on. Copy. Control. Okay, we're in the match, guys. Can you hear me, guys? Hello? Okay, guys, this is an annoying video. So, I'm gonna keep saying it. Subscribe, 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 blah, blah, blah. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe to Trickster Family Gaming. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Okay, so we're landing down. Remember, half the words I will say in this video is subscribe. I might as well just hold up. Hold on. I can't mute myself. Anyway, subscribe, 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 subscribe. Oh my god, why is that so loud? Wait, subscribe, subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe to my YouTube channel and subscribe to other YouTubers. Subscribe, subscribe. Everyone, actually, please do subscribe and like, because I will be wasting a lot of my time. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Hold on. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Okay, we're gonna get in this car. We're gonna do something. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Okay, next let's go to Minecraft. Because I think we're wasting more time there. Back to this. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Okay, we're back in Minecraft. Oh yeah, guys, don't ask, but I'm now a duck. I'm now a duck. Oh yeah, I changed my username a few weeks ago. I'm gonna change it back, but right now it's stuck like it is. Yeah. So subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Yeah. Why am I doing this? Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Why am I doing this? My life. I could be doing something else. But subscribe, and like the video. Subscribe. Why do I do this? I don't know really what to do. Oh yeah, it's loading. Okay, good. Oh yeah, these are all my games if you want me to play one of them. Anyway, subscribe. I think I've said this like 100, maybe 50 times by now, or 100. If somebody's counting these, type the number in comments. Subscribe. Oh yeah, the comments are also going to be having subscribes. Subscribe. Well done. Subscribe. What the heck? Refresh. Subscribe. Can't play this now, I guess. Subscribe. Okay. So we can't play that. Let's play. I guess we'll play Human Fall Flat. Why we say this? Subscribe. Actually, you know what? This video, how long has this been? No, I want to know. No, let me see. Subscribe. Subscribe. I've been saying this for 12 minutes. I think that's enough. Hope you liked the video. Make sure to like and subscribe.